Hello y bienvenidos. Today's video is all about mastering the enhanced input system in Unreal Engine 5.1 and onwards. In any type of game or virtual experience, the way you control your character is one of the most important aspects of it. If the controls feels sluggish and the reactions feels delayed, it won't matter that your game looks beautiful, people just won't play it. In this comprehensive guide, we will cover a wide range of topics to help you unlock the full potential of your game controls inside your Unreal Engine projects, elevating the player experience and making your games more accessible to a wider audience. Learn to create an action game in Unreal Engine 5 at unfgames.com. The first thing we need to do is create a project that we can use with the new enhanced input, which is any project from the 5.1 onwards. In my case, I'll use 5.1. And let's wait for the launcher to load. In the Unreal Project browser, let's go to Games, Blank Project, and let's give it a name. We give it a name, let's click Create. Now we have the blank project that we can use to start doing stuff with the enhanced input. To start, what you need to know about the enhanced input is that it provides developers a way of adding advanced input features to their project, like complex input handling or runtime control remapping. We can also add dynamic contextual input mappings when we need. And it's a way to deal with a large number of actions that behave differently depending on the current state of the player. So this system has four main concepts, and I'll just create a folder so we can add more stuff. Enhanced input basics. The first one is input actions. You can create an input action by right-clicking, going to Input, and Input Action. If you do not have this for whatever reason, make sure that you're using the Unreal version 5.1 onwards. So let's create an input action. This input action, usually you want to call it input action underscore and the name of the action. Could be crouch, could be fire weapon. Let's just call it fire weapon. Now, an input action is a data asset that represents something that the user can do, like crouch or like firing a weapon. So this is an asset that will represent the action. The next thing you need to know is about input mapping context. Let's create one. Input mapping context. And usually this type of assets, you will find it that they are called input mapping context. And the name of the user or the name of the actual character that will perform the actions. Usually you just call it player, or you can also call it default. I'll just call it player. The input mapping contexts are a collection of input actions that represents a certain context that the player can be in. They describe the rules for what triggers are given input actions, and these mapping contexts can be dynamically added, removed, or prioritized for each user. So we create actions, input actions, and we put them inside input mapping contexts. So if you double click an input action, you will find this information, an action description, if you consume an input, trigger when paused, and more stuff that we will touch later. By later I mean in a few minutes. And in the input mapping context, you will see these mappings. If you add a mapping, you can select an input action here. And here you can select the actual key you want to bind to this input action. So for now, it's pretty straightforward. You want to shoot with your left click, you search for the mouse, left mouse button. You can also click here and press any key or press the actual mouse, and it can bind pretty easily. Now, you will find these two categories, triggers and modifiers, that are also part of these four main concepts. The first two are input actions. The second one is input mapping context. The third one is input modifier. These are preprocessors that alter the raw input values that Unreal Engine receives before sending them to the input triggers. So these are the modifiers. You can add new modifiers either in the mapping context or in the input action. And let me delete it in the input action. So the way modifier works is that they modify the input that it receives. For example, if I'm going forward with my left thumbstick, probably that thumbstick will give me a value of maybe 1. If we negate that value, it's like multiplying it by -1. So we are modifying the current input so we can get an inverted scheme. So when I press forward in the thumbstick, I'll go backwards. And we will see concrete examples in a minute. I just wanted to let you know that you can modify the information that the inputs give us. We can multiply it, we can negate it, we can smooth it, we can create dead zones, we can do a lot of stuff with the modifiers. Finally, the fourth concept is input triggers. And they determine whether the user input, whether after passing through an optional list of input modifier, which is this one, they determine if the user input should activate the corresponding input action within its input mapping context, which is this one. So what does it mean? I can specify with the triggers what do I mean by firing a weapon. Is firing a weapon means that I need to hold and release the button? Does it mean that I just need to release it? I just need to press it? I need to do a combo action? And we will see also little examples on how to use these triggers and what does it mean for an input action to get triggered. But this is the core concepts, the main 4 concepts, which is input actions, mapping concepts, mapping context, modifiers for the inputs, and how to define when is my input triggering. For this next part, what I want to do is make a comparison between the legacy way of doing inputs and the new way. To do that, we're going to import a character from Paragon, which uses the legacy inputs. So let's go to the Unreal Launcher. Just click on the Marketplace and search for Paragon Aurora. So if you search it here, you can type Aurora. Well, you can type it, maybe I can't. And just select Paragon Aurora and you will see this asset. This asset is free, so I can just add it to my project. Let's search for my project, Enhanced Inputs. Here it is. If your project doesn't show up, you just need to click on Show All Projects and it should appear. So I'll just search for a project. Was it procedural? If your project shows you this error, you can always select a previous version. Now it seems that they have updated it, so enhanced input. Oh, let's see if they updated it. Let's add it to a project. Just put yes, sometimes that message appears and it's, even though we don't have the actual asset. So let's wait. I'll just minimize this. Now we see in the folders that a Paragon Aurora folder has been added. Let's click on it, characters, heroes, Aurora, and here we will find the actual character blueprint. To use it, I'll just create a new level, a basic one, so it doesn't take as much to load. I'll drag and drop the Aurora character, and here in the details panel, I'm going to search auto possess player, and you can click on general, you can type here auto possess, and in auto possess player, let's select player 0 and let's clean our search. Now, whenever we press play, we will possess this character, which means that we are playing as this character. You will see that we cannot move it around, but we can click to attack. Let's open the character and see why this is happening. So we can right click the character, edit. We can also browse to the asset and double click here in the content browser. And let me just close the other assets. And here we have our character. We have this icon because input actions and input axis are not set up. We can click to attack because here we're using the raw input value. So here we have the raw event. And if for some reason here, where's the movement forward, I decided to just connect the W key, it will start working, but that's not the way you usually do stuff. Maybe for debugging or testing, but usually you will find input axis and for the jump, input actions. Now, the old way of doing this is going to edit, project settings, and in the project settings, which I'm going to enlarge, we go to the input category. Here there's action mappings that are used for specific actions, for example, the jump, and we can create one. Click on the plus button, type jump, and now here we can select the key, which I can click on this button and press spacebar. With this, if I compile, my input action will no longer give me a warning, and when I play the game, you will see that I can still attack, and if I press spacebar, I can jump. Now that is action mappings, which were very useful for actions that are very specific, that you just want to know if you press the key and whenever you released it. So you have here pressed and release. Now, the other mapping that I will need to move my character is the input axis, and the input axis move forward is giving a value. This is especially useful if you have a thumbstick, because a thumbstick will give you a value between -1 and 1. So if you're not doing anything, you get a 0 value. If you press a little bit forward, you can get a 0.2 value. If you go all the way, you get a 1 type of value. So to create that, we can here axis mappings. The new axis mapping will be called move forward. And here, we could bind it to the gamepad and bind it to the gamepad left thumbstick y-axis because it's forward and backward. And this would work, but if I needed to use the keyboards, we will need to, we don't need to create another axis mapping. We just need to add another key mapping, which is through this plus button. Now here I can select my W key. And if I want to go backwards, I can add another key, select my S key, and here I want to modify the value because when I go forward, this should be 1. But if I go backward, it should be -1. So I'll just multiply this key. So whenever I press S, we're modifying the input received. This gives me the information that the S key was pressed. If it's 0, it's not pressed. If it's 1, it's pressed. But we are also modifying that value, multiplying it by -1, which is also called negating it. Now this way, if we compile, we see that this is removed. If we play, we will see that if I press S, I'll move forward. If I press W, I move forward, and if I press S, I'll move backwards. So that's the way the old system worked. But this changes a little bit in the new one. Now, what we need to do is pass all these inputs, and I'm going to just minimize this screen just so I have it at hand. I need to create new actions for a new system and replace the old events. So let's start with the jump, which is the easier one. We talked about input actions. Now, an action that we can do is jump. So let's create that. Right click, input action, jump. And I believe the third person example uses jump, so I'm just going to call it character jump. You can just call it jump, but I know that there will be another asset that will be called jump, so that's why I'm just calling it another name. So this is my action. The character jumps. I would just call it jump, by the way, but now this action, I want to determine if it's like an input action that I only want to know if it's pressed or released, or if it is an input axis where I need a value that goes from -1 to 1. The jump is pretty straightforward, so if I double click it, the value type that I will use is digital bool. I only want to know if my if my player pressed the key or not. That's the only thing I want to know. Now I'll create. Oh, let's go. Let's continue with the character jump. Yeah. I'll go to the input mappings and I'll add a new mapping. Here, I need to select the new input action, which is the character jump. And here I will bind my spacebar. Do I need to modify it? No. Do I need to change the way this triggers? We will see. If you needed another key, again, you can add a new key here and you will get the same options for modification. Maybe I want my gamepad to be able to jump with the face button. So this is the button. This face button is usually the A button, or it could also be, was it the circle? No, the X button in a PlayStation controller. So this way our character can jump either with the spacebar or by pressing the gamepad. So we have this context where we can fire a weapon and we can jump, but we need to tell our character to be able to use that context. So we need to add that mapping, that input mapping context to this specific character. So let's go to the begin play. Here we don't have anywhere to add it. And usually the mapping contexts are either added to the begin play or to the on possess. And I don't have it here. We can go to function and search for possessed. And I'll drag it to the top. Possess event. So it's either to the begin play or to the possess event. Begin play because whenever you're playing at the start of the game, maybe your player needs to move, you will add it here. If you don't want to do it that way, whenever we possess this character means that our player controller, which means that our player is going to send inputs to this controller. This happens automatically most of the times. You can also add it here. If you will be using multiple characters, I would add it here. If you are just going to use one, just begin play is fine. And it will also depend on when the player will get to play or not. But in our case, begin play works perfectly. So to add the context, we need to get first the player controller. So we will get the controller. And the controller is a little class that handles the inputs of our player. So if I'm going to control this character, our controller, which I'll try to draw a simple controller, hopefully that looks like a controller, and here are the buttons. Okay, terrible controller. Okay, but you get the gist. The brain of the character will be the inputs that we give them. And if those inputs come from a player, this is called a player controller. Now, this does not represent the actual controller in your hand or the keyboards. This represents the will of the player, the actions that the player wants to take. This doesn't actually represent the hardware. Keep that in mind. Now, for the player to move a character, this player controller needs to possess a character. So when you go up or forward, it tells the actual character to go forward or jump. So a player controller possesses a character, which is actually a pawn, but let's just not get into the specifics of it. And this way, we can make stuff happen. Whenever we press W, the player controller processes it. It looks for any character that it's possessing, and because it's possessing, which if you remember correctly, we are auto-possessing this player. That's why the input happens inside this character. Now we can get the controller inside the character to see who is controlling this character. We want to check if this is a player, so let's cast this to a player controller. Now this player controller has inside it the enhanced input subsystem. So let's search for it. Here it is, enhanced player local subsystem. Again, I believe I pressed enter too fast. Here it is. And from here, just in case, it's a good idea to check if this is valid. So, again, I pressed too fast. Is valid has two flavors. One is a function which returns a boolean. One is this macro. You can use either one of them by using a branch node, which I just type if and it's immediately give me the branch. Both of these will work the same. So let's just use the macro. And after we check that this enhanced input local player subsystem is valid, it exists in the game, then we can add the mapping context. So from here, from this node, we will drag a new one. Let's type add mapping, and this is the one we are looking for. Add mapping context. So the mapping context, and I'm going to connect it to is valid, is the one that we have created here, where we can jump and we can fire a weapon. So let's select it. Input mapping context player. Now with this done, nothing will happen just yet. But we have determined that this character that is being possessed by my player will be able to use the actions inside this input mapping context, which are actions that we have created previously here. So we need to use those actions now inside this character, and it's a good idea to always comment stuff. I don't really like to comment that much because my perspective on it is that the code should be readable enough for me not to comment. But if you want to add comments, like, it's fine. If you're learning especially and you are forgetting a lot of stuff, it's especially useful to add comments. You just select the nodes you want to comment and press the letter C. And if you didn't understand my accent, I'm referring to this letter. So the C letter, and here we can type adding the player mapping context. There we go. With the input mapping context added, we can start using the actions, which is, I'll put it near the actual action. Input action jump, this is the old way of doing stuff. We right click on a empty space and just search for the name of your input action. In my case, it's called character jump. So I can just call IA underscore, and here it is, character jump. You have the input as an event, and you have the value. We will get the value with the event, so I do need the event. So let's click here, and you will see that it's a little bit different. Just for it to work, I'm going to remove this. We're going to explain the states in a minute. And I'm going to connect started to the jump. And I'm going to connect completed to the stop jumping. And we can move this here. I'll just copy the text, delete the comment, select this, create the comment, and paste the text here. Let's see if it's working. Can I jump? I can. Now, if I press Shift F1, my mouse will be released. So I can hold Shift, press F1, my mouse is released. And with my mouse, I can move my window so I can see if this, what's happening here, yeah? If this is working. So first click here if this was not selected. Now is the time to select Aurora player character. This is the debug way of selecting which character do I want to see. And now let's go back to the game, click on the game and press spacebar. And you will see how the nodes light up, how the wires are telling me the execution flow of this. And you will see that depending on how you press the spacebar, you get this started always immediately, but the completed action will always release. It will always trigger when we release the key. So I can hold the key and the completed action will not trigger until I just release it. If I release it immediately, then you can see the wires turning on and off, and we'll go into detail why this happens. But what we do know now is that our jump is working correctly and you have created the first input using the enhanced input system. The second input we're going to create is the camera movement. So for the camera movement, we have two inputs, turn and look up. Let's start with the turn. For the turn, we need to create, again, the action to do the turning. So let's go to input, input action. Now, let's call it input action turn. And I will also create the look up. I'll just first open the turn, and this one is an axis, or at least it says here that it's an axis. So we will need to receive a value between -1 and 1. This will get determined by either the gamepad or by the mouse. So we no longer need just to know if it's pressed or not. We're gonna click here on value type and we will select axis 1D, which is 1 dimension. Here it says a float. So let's select it. Let's save it. And in the content browser or content drawer, let's duplicate this. And in the Aurora player character, we will see that we also need a look up. So we have created these two input actions. We need to determine now which keys do we want to bind to this action. So in the mapping context, again, I'll select the turn, and here I'll select the lookup. For the turn, I want my mouse in the X axis. So if I'm moving my mouse from left to right, I want my camera to turn. And for the lookup, mouse Y axis. So when we move it up and down, we get the camera movement. If you want to use the gamepad, we can add it. And this will be gamepad, left thumbstick X, and in the lookup is gamepad, left thumbstick Y. So everything thus far is pretty similar. Let's save it. You will see that you can get a little bit of trouble when you have an input modifier that is null. Whenever you have any type of null values, or for example, if you just created a new key and you didn't put anything in it, you will receive this type of warning. You just need to see where the error is. And it's complaining about a null input modifier on one key mapping. The key mapping are these ones. And they were working correctly until I added these two. So let's see if there's a modifier in one of them. Here? Where did I put a modifier then? Here, spacebar modifier. None. This is what is making me not able to save, or it's showing me that error because this is here. So we move that modifier, save it, now it's fine. Now with this created, let's go back to the character and let's change these inputs, and we can delete this input action, and we can close this one. Let's right click and let's call, come on, input axis turn. The one that we created was input action turn, and the other one is input action lookup. And now this is where things get a little bit different, and I'm going to move my enhanced input to the side. So I have a little bit more of space. Here it is. Mouse input. The turn, I need to always know whenever we are pressing the value. So using started won't help me that much. And again, we will go in depth to what each of these states are and how can we manipulate them to our liking. But in my case, I want to use the trigger, because this will get triggered as long as I'm pressing the button. And even if I'm not using it, if it's 0, then it's fine if it's triggering, because we will get a value of 0 and nothing will happen. Now, this is fine, but we need a value. And because we define that our input action turn is an axis, we will get the float value here. So we just need to connect it. We can delete the input axis turn. Input axis lookup, trigger, and connect the action value like this. Now let's see if this is working. Let's save and compile. Let's press play. And now you see that we can move our camera, but there's a little bit of extra movement that I'm not really liking. Now, why is that? I actually don't know, but we will see in a minute. Yeah, something's triggering this. Oh, it was my controller. Let me just turn it off. Yeah, it was my controller adding the input. Okay, so you will see that it's moving with the mouse, and I just noticed that for my controller inputs I messed it up. So let me just fix it real quick. Gamepad. Oh, the turn should be the right thumbstick X, and in lookup it should be gamepad right thumbstick Y. Okay, so with my controller turned off, I can press play and see that whenever I move the mouse left and right, we are looking, we're turning our camera. And whenever I move up and down, we are also turning our camera, but only up and down. Now, I don't really like how it moves up and down. I prefer an inverted type of controls. So whenever you move your mouse up, you're actually moving the camera the other way. So this is where we can modify the input. I want to invert this lookup, then I can go to the input mappings, go to lookup mouse, modifiers, and here we can negate this. This will multiply the value by -1, and when we test it again, you will see that whenever you go down, your camera will invert the movement. And for me, this feels a lot better. So that's why I always set it up like this. If you liked the other way of handling it, you can just ignore the modifier and go with it. And I will add also the modifier for the gamepad example, for the gamepad input. And take in consideration that these modifiers and triggers can be added here in the mapping context, but they also can be added in the input action. So I could also negate it here. This will need to, this depends on what you want. For example, and this is actually a good example that I didn't have written in my notes. The lookup in the mapping context, I'm negating it so I can flip the controls, right? And if I wanted to negate, to invert also the controllers for the gamepad, I will need to create the negate again. But if both are gonna have negate, then I can just go to the input action and add the modifier there. Save it. And I can delete this modifier, otherwise I'll negate it twice. Save this and play. And now, whichever key I map to this action, it will always be negated. In this case, that is exactly what I want, but there may be cases where you don't want that. So if you don't want all the keys to be affected by the same modifiers, then you can select the modifiers and triggers individually by each mapped key. With the camera working, what we need to do is make the character walk again. So our mouse input is working correctly. We no longer need this gamepad input because here we're modifying it by a turn rate, which is a multiplication. But if we wanted to do the exact same thing, we can add a modifier. Turn rate, you see that it has a 45 value, which we are multiplying by the axis value. And in the lookup rate, it has the same number. So in our mapping, for our gamepad, we can add that modifier, which is a scalar. And we need to define by how much we want to multiply. So we can just fill everything to 45. So you're finally seeing why the enhanced input is making stuff easier. We don't really need to worry too much about extra logic. We can just put it in the mapping context. And I will do the same for the turn. Again, I'm only modifying it for the gamepad. Modifiers, scalar, and 45 in every, yeah, in every space. Okay. So far, so good. We can delete this. And instead of this being called mouse input, we can just call it camera movement input. Now, we were talking about the movement input. And here I will do a little bit of extra stuff because we can do exactly the same and create a input action for the move forward event and for the move right. But we can also, and let me save everything, we can also go to input, create a new input action, call it input action movement, open it. I can close the lookup. And here in the value type, instead of using the axis 1 dimension, we can use the axis 2 dimension. This is especially useful if you are gonna have input coming from a thumbstick, because the thumbstick or any type of stick has 2 dimensions, either forward, backwards, left, right, and all the diagonals. So the camera movement, we can also do it this way, but I wanted to show you a simple way to do it, the normal way to do it, so you can choose whatever suits you the most. So in this case, for the movement, I'm gonna use the axis 2D. Axis 3D usually is for motion controllers because you will have up and down, not only front, right, left, and back. You will also have up and down, but in this case, I'm not using this. This is usually for VR. Because I'm using a thumbstick, or I may use a thumbstick, I'll use axis 2D. Let's save it. Let's go to the input mapping context and let's add it. Here, where's my movement? Here it is. Now, this movement will be mapped to two values, and not the left mouse button. If I'm using a gamepad, I want that value to be the left thumbstick to the axis. And that's it. And if I'm using the keyboard, I don't remember if this is it, but we will check. But for now, this is it. For the keyboard, let's type W, add another one, type S, add another one, type D, another key, and type A. WSDA or WASD, WASD, whatever you want to call it. That's the keys that we're gonna use to move around. Now, if I leave it like this, every time I press one of these keys, it will give me the value in X positive, which is 1 in X, which should be the right one. But if you're not sure and you don't want to remember all the setup and you want to test stuff, it's a good idea to play around with this type of inputs. So let's see what's happening. In the Aurora player character, let me remove this by adding our new movement. Here I have an action value, which is a vector 2D. I want to split this. So I have the value in X and the value in Y. So far so good. For the forward, I want to connect this. Whenever this is triggered, I want the value in X to be used. And I can delete this. And also when the input is triggered, I want this move right node. And I want the value in Y. Why am I doing it like this? Well, actually, I don't know. Because in a controller, whenever you go forward and backward, that's the Y value. And whenever you go side to side, that's the X value. So let me change the input actually. X should be for right. So the scale value here will be from X. And the Y value will be for going forward. Yeah, that makes at least more sense to me. Okay, so let's delete this. And we can increase the comment section. So if you want to move forward, use the value in Y. If you want to move side to side, use the value in X. You can interchange this and we can make it work, but for now, you can just leave it like this. Okay, we have connected the input action to the actual movement. If we press play and press W, I'm moving to the right. If I press S, I'm moving to the right. If I press any of the keys, I'm always moving to the right. This means that when I'm using an input action that uses a 2D vector, by default, any key mapped to it will make it move to X positive, which in the case of D, this is correct. It's fine. In the case of A, I just need to negate it. So modify it. Here we are in the A key, modifier, negate. So we go to the other side. If we press play, and I'm going to use the hotkey Alt-P to play it. If I press D, working fine. If I press A, working fine. If I press S or W, it's not working like it should. W should send me a Y coordinate. So we need to switch where does the value of W is sending the input. So we need to modify again the input, modifiers, add an element, and here we will find Swizzle. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but Swizzle input axis values, which says useful to map a one-dimension input onto the y-axis of the 2D action, which is exactly what I need right now. So let's Swizzle it. Go to S, again, Swizzle the values, and negate the value so we can go backwards. Let's save it. Ctrl P, W, going forward, S, going backward, D, going right, and A, going to the left. Now, I will try it with my gamepad. Let me turn it on. And let's see if this setup is fine. Alt P. You can see that it's moving by itself a little bit. And I'm not pressing anything. If I start moving my left thumbstick, it is moving around. If I move it a little bit to the front, you will see that it's doing this running animation, but slowly. And it really depends on the value I'm giving to my thumbstick. The same will happen if I try to move my thumbstick. It's doing that because remember that we are modifying the turns. I believe we don't really need this scalar for the actual thumbstick. If I remove it and play it, then the thumbstick, oh come on, where's the lookup? Here it is, modifiers. I'll just negate this. Nope, negate. It's fine. Okay, hopefully no more panty shots. Perfect. Yeah. So you will see that I'm getting weird behavior, and it has to do with the actual value of the sticks. Whenever you're using a thumbstick, you need to take in consideration that whenever you release them, they, or not always, they will go to the 0 value. They will have a little bit of movement, like 0.001, and that's making my character do that stuff. A way to fix this is for the gamepad, where's the movement here? Gamepad movement is to add a modifier, and we can add a dead zone, which it means that if it's lower than this value, then I don't want to use it. And if it's higher than this value, I also don't want to use it. In this case, the default value is actually fine. You will see that our character will no longer flicker because we're ignoring values that are lower than 0.2. And it should be a good idea to also add that dead zone to the turning. So let's add the modifier dead zone, the lookup, dead zone, and we can stack modifiers, which is actually pretty nice. You usually want the dead zone to be the first one, and then you can modify the values on top. So now we have our character moving correctly. If you wanted to avoid, like, this character doesn't have a walking animation, and you want to avoid this, then you can, here in the mapping context, in the movement, for the gamepad key or mapping, in the modifiers after the dead zone, we can add a scalar again, and we can multiply it by maybe 50. So we always get the full value. Now if we press play, even if I'm putting my thumbstick a little bit forward, it's always moving the full direction, the full motion. It's not letting me walk a little bit because I didn't have the animation for it. Yeah, so that's a good way of implementing the movement and modifying the values to get a better result for your game. Let's go back to the character, and we will see that we have finished implementing this. This reset VR orientation, I don't really need it. Oh, this attack, that I do really need to implement. Let's do it really quickly so we can finish implementing the legacy. Oh, porting the legacy inputs to the new one. So here, I'll just change this fire weapon to attack because they work really the same. Attack. Digital input is fine. Movement, I can close it. And the attack is left button. And also, for the gamepad, this will be, what did they map that? Face button left. So again, oh, I have my gamepad connected, so I can just press it. Face button left. This is fine. We have already done this, so that's why I'm just speeding through it. Attack. And here, because I just want to know if it's pressed or released, here in pressed, go to started. You can drag and the pins that way. If you go hover the pin, press shift, hold shift and click on it, and you can hold it. And you can duplicate the pin connection like this. If you hold shift, if you hold alt, you can remove it. And if you hold control, you can move it around. I should do a tip on that. Maybe a short could be good, but yeah. Now we can build this because I just wanted this start. And now everything should be working, my attacks, my jump, my camera movement, and my overall movement. Perfect. Now that you know how the enhanced input works, it's a good idea to check the third-person example, because they do things a little bit different. Let's go to the content drawer, add feature or content pack, and here you will have the third-person example. Yep. So Blueprint or simply C++ if you are using it. Third-person example, Blueprint, and add it to the project. Let's wait a little bit. Now that it's added, let's go to the content drawer, and it should be in third-person Blueprint's third-person character. You will see that this sample character is doing the same thing. We add the input mapping, we have input actions. In this case, they did the camera input in the same one. They just call it look. Movement input in the same input action, jump, and that's it. I was telling you that it was a little bit different because here the X is what they consider to be, I believe, left and right and forward, backward. Yeah, I believe it's the same. It's the same setup. And in terms of inputs, you will have your actions, which are the same. And you will have the inputs for mobile devices, which is just touching. Inputs for the arrow keys. Gamepad adds the modifier dead zone and scalar. Oh, it did the same thing. They didn't multiply this because it's not needed, because the left thumbstick will only give you X and Y. And in the look, instead of using mouse X and mouse Y, you can use the mouse X, Y to the axis to get the same functionality. And here you have a negation, so you can invert the scheme. So yeah, the negate probably only negates one axis, the Y axis. Yeah, that's what I thought. It's the same setup. It has its differences, but the overall implementation is the same. So let's close it. You are no longer a stranger to the enhanced input system. And you will see that a lot of examples are still using the legacy system, and now you can port them to the new one. That especially rings true for our tutorials that were done with previous versions. So if you are asking for the enhanced inputs in those tutorials, in those old tutorials, I will redirect you to this video. Now that you know how to create the inputs, it's a good idea to go a little bit in depth. Remember, I told you that we were going to go a little bit more into what these states mean. Well, these are trigger states. A trigger state represents the current state of the action. So to show it better, I'm gonna press play. I'm gonna go to the enter command text box, and here let's type show debug space and enhanced input. This will let me, and I'll press enter, this will let me see the actual values of our enhanced input. So for example, if I'm moving forward, whoops, let me click actually on the game so we have control of our character. You will see that whenever I'm pressing a button, stuff is happening at the left side. Now, for example, if I press W here, I'm seeing the action that is being activated, that is being used. In this case, is green, so it means it has been triggered. A triggered action means that it has completed the evaluation of all trigger requirements and it's been triggered. For example, if I have a press and release trigger, then the trigger is sent when the user releases the key. And let's do an example of that. So you see here that the movement is triggered, and you can see the key that triggered the movement, which is the W. For the attack, we have a click. Let's go back to the player, attack, left mouse button, and let's modify this trigger. Let's say that this will be a press and release, hold and release. And this hold and release, and we will go into more detail about each one of these ones, but for this one, it's pretty easy to know what you should do. Hold and release, hold time threshold means how much time do I need to hold the key. So let's say 2 seconds. The actuation threshold means if the input needs to be above this value. If it's a key, it will always be from 0. It will be always 0 or 1. If it's a thumbstick, it may be from 0 to 1 or -1 to 0. So you can modify this actuation threshold. There it is, or at least half of the word. So you can choose this threshold based on this value. And affected by time dilation means if you are modifying how fast or how slow the game is running, you can select if it's affected by it or if it isn't. So these 2 seconds could be longer or shorter depending on how fast your game is going. So we have this attack. We have changed the trigger to hold and release. Let's save it. Let's go back to the test map and let's activate again the show debug enhanced input. If you click on the text box and you press the arrow key, the up arrow key, you will see the last commands that you did. So we can just press that, enter, and now we have it. So for the attack, if I press my left click, you now will see that the action is no longer green, is yellow. So right now it has a ongoing state, but before entering ongoing, it has entered a started. And if you can't see it, some people like to see my horrible handwriting. Oh, is this not working? Oh, I'll draw it with the mouse then. Started. Before entering ongoing, the started state happens. So it happens whenever the trigger, which is the hold and release, begins the evaluation. So whenever I press the button, the started state happens. Now, because we need to hold the button for 2 seconds, we are not triggering this event, this action. We are still evaluating if this action can be triggered. So it's ongoing. When the trigger is still being processed, for example, in this press and hold action, it will be ongoing while the user is holding down the button before the duration that we specified before is reached. Now, depending on the triggers, this event will fire every tick while the action is evaluated once it received the input value. So we can see it now in real time. I press the button, ongoing. Whenever I reach that 2 seconds, it's still ongoing because our trigger event is hold and release. But now I have pressed, I have hold the key more than 2 seconds. So when I release it, it will get triggered and it will be very fast. But you should see a little bit of green. Did you saw it? You didn't saw it? Okay, I can change the hold and release to just hold, and I will hold it for 3 seconds. Let's save it. Go to my map and press play. Oh, I need to shift F1, up arrow key, enter, and now I should be able to see it. I press, now it's ongoing, and when it reached the threshold of 3 seconds, now it's triggered. So how does this look for my character? Now, you will see that my character was always attacking is because I was using the started event, and every input action, whenever it starts looking if it's going to be triggered or not, it always triggers this started state. So if you wanted to look how the pins actually looks like, I will show you. Trigger. Started. Ongoing. For now, we haven't talked about canceled yet. So let's press this here. And whenever I press my attack, it starts. Right now it's ongoing. and now it's triggered. And it's firing every tick until I just released my mouse. Now, the cancel and the complete event are kind of similar. The complete triggers, you enter the complete state. Let me rephrase that. You enter the complete state when the trigger evaluation process is completed. And you enter the canceled state when the triggering was cancelled. For example, a user lets go of a button before the press and hold action was triggered. So let's test that. Let's connect this to cancelled and connect this to completed. So we need to hold for 3 seconds. So I'm holding it, we're ongoing. Triggered means that I have fulfilled the 3 seconds, but I have not released the key yet. When I release it, it should print completed, and it does. If I'm holding it again and release it before we complete it, then we go to the cancel state. And that's how the trigger states work. And we can do a lot of stuff with these trigger states. Let me just remove everything here. Connect back the started. Compile and save. And in the attack, I'll just remove the trigger that I added here, just to have everything clean. Save all, and let's continue. Let's do a super quick example of using those trigger states that we just learned. Let's open the character again. I'm gonna use Ctrl E, and here, let's go to the jumping part. So we have a started and a completed state. We have a jump and a stop jumping. Right now, this may not mean too much for you, but for the character class, you have the ability to hold the key, and depending on the number of seconds you're holding the key, you can jump higher. You can enable this functionality if you go to the class defaults and you search jump. Here you have stuff from the movement component, which is this one. But again, I'm gonna click in the class default. What I'm looking for is here under character. And here you have a jump max hold time, which is the one we're looking for, and the jump max count, which it's also useful, right? You can use this to have a double jump. Very simple. You just put 2 here, and you press play, and now you can have a double jump. The other one lets you hold the key. So here, it's really important that you know when the key started, so you can jump, and when did it end, so you can stop jumping. So in our case, again, click class defaults. I'm going to change the value inside jump max hold time, and let's say I wanted 0.5. So you need 0.5 seconds holding the jump key for our character to get the maximum height. So you press play now, and if you just tap the key, the spacebar key, you get this little jump. If you hold the jump key, you can get higher. This is a functionality especially useful for any type of platformers. So you can really get super precise when or where do you want to fall. And because we have also activated the double jump, you will see that I can double jump using the same functionality. The next topic will be the input triggers. Input triggers determine whether user input, after passing through an optional list of input modifiers that we have already seen how they work. Well, after passing through them, we determine if the input should activate the corresponding input action within its input mapping context. So if we go to the input mapping context, you will see that in any of our input actions, we have these triggers, which those are the ones that we are going to see right now. So after passing through the modifiers that modify the raw input, we can determine if the input should trigger or not. And there are a lot of ways. Here I will add an element, and you will see a lot of ways that our input can trigger. And I'm going to create a little example so you can see how you can use each one of these inputs. For this, I'll create a new input action, which is going to be similar to the attack, but let's just duplicate this. Let's call it heavy attack. And this heavy attack, yeah, it's fine. Consume input. I only want to know if it's pressed or not. It's okay. And you will see that you can also add triggers to the input action by itself. So let's just save it here. We just clean everything. And I will add it to my input mapping context for now. I'm going to use this input as a test, so we may change stuff in the future. I will click here and then I will right click so it's mapped to the right mouse button. Right, so let's start with the down trigger. Down. Now, to use the input, I do need to add it here if I want to do something with it. If I don't need to do something right now, we can still test it. If we go here, again, let's use our trusty show debug enhanced input, and you will still see that the heavy attack should be somewhere here. Here it is. And if I press the right click, you will see what's happening now. Now, right now, my trigger is down, which is the default behavior. It will trigger as long as the key is pressed. So as you see, right now it's not triggering. As soon as I right click, then you will see that it's being triggered. Let's change it. Let's stop execution. And here, let's go to the next logical one so we can build on top of each other. So we know what down means. As soon as the key is down, is pressed, then it will trigger. Now, pressed is different. If I select press triggers only once. So it triggers once when the key is pressed. Holding it won't trigger it again. So again, I will save this. I have some invalid data, which could be, probably I just left something here, this one. Yeah, that little test that I did, that counts as invalid data. Okay, so again, heavy attack, let's change it to press. And whenever we press play, I'll press the up key so I can redo the command. You will see that here in the heavy attack, the trigger, it triggers so fast we don't even see it, but you can almost see the green there. So this is triggering, but only once. We can double test this, double check it by adding here the actual heavy attack. And here in trigger, we add a print string. Hello, compile, play. And whenever we right click, it says hello. Perfect. The next one that we're going to see is the hold. Or no, let's continue with the released. Because why not? So released. Released has an ongoing state and will trigger only once when the key is released. So what it means is that this triggering will trigger a lot. So I will see a lot of those hellos. But only when it's ongoing. So if I wanted to see the hellos while I'm holding it, then that's the way you can make it happen. So just so it's a lot clearer to see it, let's press play again, show debug enhance input, and click on the viewport. We are holding it, and you will see that the heavy attack has an ongoing state here. Ongoing. And when I release it, it will trigger. Yeah, so this kind of behavior could be very useful if you need to know how much time you were holding the key before it got triggered. Let's go to the next one. The next one will be hold. And what hold does is triggers when the hold time has been achieved. Where is the hold time? You can expand all the events to tweak the functionality. So here the threshold is 1 second, so I need to press 1 second. If I change it to 2, I will need to hold my key 2 seconds. You can decide if it triggers once, if it's a one-shot, or if it's trigger repeatedly after you hold it. So if it's not a one-shot, then let's press play. Let's show debug. You will see that as soon as I'm holding it for more than 2 seconds, or right now it's at 1 second, I believe, because I didn't save. But now we are triggering a lot of the actual input. If I just wanted to trigger once, I'll just put it one shot, save it, and test it again. Hold it for 2 seconds, and it says hello, and you will see that the actual input action is completed. So there is no more ongoing state while I'm still holding the key, because right now I'm still holding the heavy attack. So whenever I release it, then it ends. And it gets cancelled if I just release it before the ongoing state, which means that we are just waiting for the 2 seconds we want to hold. So if I release it before those 2 seconds, the cancelled event happens. So we can put here triggered. Let's just copy and paste that. Cancelled. And completed. You hold it, completed, trigger, completed, The order is very important. Whatever happens first will be at the bottom. So that's why trigger was at the bottom. And if I release it before, then the cancelled state happens. Yeah, so thus far, pretty simple stuff. You can probably just test it and you will get the gist of it. So let's continue. The next one. Oh, and before I continue, here you have affected by time dilation. Sometimes you want to change the game speed to get some slow-mos, to get some nice effects. You can do it by changing the time dilation of the game. But if you don't want that dilation to affect the input, you can enable or disable it. So in this case, right now it's not affected. If I enable it, then it will be affected by any type of time dilation. And this threshold, I believe I did explain it, but just in case, I will explain it again very quickly. Sometimes your input is just not a 0 or a 1. Sometimes, usually when it's a thumbstick, you can get values between 0 and 1 or -1, depending on how you have set it up. So this allows to have a threshold of how much do you want your value to be in order for it to actually count as a trigger, right? So in case this was an actual trigger button in the controller, maybe if you're pressing it lightly, it will be 0.2, and this won't start the ongoing event or the actual trying to see if this input action will trigger or not. So you will need to press it a little bit harder so you can go past this threshold. Right, so let's continue with the hold and release, which is also pretty similar. Hold time, again, let's put it 2 seconds. Let's save it. And in the hold and release trigger, this will trigger when you release the key after holding it the amount of time specified. So let's press play. Let's again open the show debug, and I will hold the button for 2 seconds, and you will see that it's not triggering. Even though I'm holding it, it won't trigger until I release the key. So whenever I release it, then it's triggered and it completes. Perfect. Let's continue. The next one is the tap. Tap. Now the tap, here you must press and release the key in a certain window of time. If you go over it, then the action is cancelled. So here we should tap the key for 0.2 seconds. I'm gonna extend it to 0.5 just to get a better idea. And again, let's press play. Let's go again to the show debug. And if I keep holding the key, it won't be considered a tap. And you will see that the event was cancelled. You can see the actual print screen in the top left corner. But if I release it immediately, then it is considered as a tap. So completed, trigger, completed, trigger. But if I hold it, then it gets cancelled. Yeah, so it's another way you can trigger your input actions that could be very, very useful for combos. Right, so let's continue. Let's try the pulse one. The pulse triggers in an interval after being pressed. It can return the completed or cancelled trigger state depending on when you release the key. So here, pulse, let's just leave this as it is. let's enable the show debug, and I will hold the key. You will see that it's getting triggered every second. If I stop holding the key, you will see that it got cancelled. Now, let's tweak a little bit of the settings. Trigger on start. This means that as soon as you press it, it will trigger. And let's see if this is true. I press it, and yes, it's triggered. It's triggering, so if you don't want that, you want for the player to hold it the amount of time in the interval, which we can put maybe to 0.3. And I want it for the player to hold it, then you can see that it only gets triggered after the first 0.3 seconds. So let's put it back to where it was. If we had a trigger limit, 0 is no limit. If we want 3 activation only, it won't matter if you keep pressing the key. Let's save this. I'll hold the key, 1, 2, 3 activation, and now it's completed. If I stop holding the key before the 3 activations completes, it means that the whole input action was cancelled. So let's put this back to 0. And well, let's go to the next one. The next one is a corded action trigger. So let's put this as a corded action. And here is where things get a little bit more complicated. Just a little bit. So let's put this as a corded action, and you will see that here it's asking me for another corded action. Now for the corded action to work, I will need to define another input action that will work with this one. So just so I have more stuff to play with, I'll create another input action. And I'll call this input action light punch. Just to give it any name. And yeah, let's leave it as it is. Let's save it with Ctrl S. And the way the corded action work is kind of like shortcuts. So this will trigger when all the actions defined are completed. This is similar to shortcut type of inputs like Ctrl Z, with the difference that the order of the key presses won't matter. It's very useful for the case where you want to have a horizontal hit and also an upper hit while pressing the up arrow. So what does it mean? For this heavy attack to trigger, I need to add my other input action, which is the light punch. And this light punch will be the Z key. So here, let's go back to the heavy attack, triggers, corded action. And I will put my light punch. So the only way the heavy attack will trigger is if the light punch is also being triggered. So if I just leave it like this, and I save it, I press play, I'll put the show debug enhanced input. Right, so you're seeing the heavy attack here and the light punch here. If I press the right mouse button, nothing happens. I mean, you will see a message that the button is being pressed, right? Because it says here true. But this is not even in an ongoing state. Now, if I press the C button is being triggered. because by default it works as the down type of trigger. If I release it, then it's completed. Pretty simple stuff. So if I press C and then hold it and then press the heavy attack, which is the right click, you will see that right now both are being triggered. If I stop pressing the C, now none of them are being triggered. But again, if I'm pressing both and I lift my right click, which is the heavy attack, then the corded action stopped working, but the hold action, then it's the hold trigger, excuse me, is still working as it should. So this can be very useful for actions where, oh, I'm pressing up, and I should have that actual. Let's say you have an fighting game, and this is the up key, and this should be actually like, oh, look upwards or something like that. I'm just calling it up key so it's super clear. And let's add the mapping here, up key. And you have this light punch. Now, you could create like a corded type of trigger to identify whenever you want your light punch to tilt upwards. And it's just a matter of putting the corded action here and selecting here the light punch. And now when you save it, right now it won't do anything, right? But let me put my debug again. I press up and see, and it gets triggered. So I wouldn't just call this up key. I would put it like upwards light punch or something like that, so we can actually get a useful name out of it, right? But yeah, that's how it goes. Now the next one, it's the combo type of trigger. And let's go back to the heavy attack. No corded action. Oh, and you can add more than one corded action if you need like to press 3 keys at the same time, or multiple keys at the same time. Now, these are corded because you need to press them at the same time for them to work. But in the case of the combos, let me just remove the triggers here. I'll tap combo, and you will see that this action immediately loses its key mapping. Now, inside the combo, you can add the actual actions that you need to press in order to get this combo, in order to get this input action called heavy attack for it to work, right? So let's say I want to press the light punch and then the up key in a succession. And here I have the time frame, the time to press the key. And there can also be action that can cancel this combo. For example, jumping may cancel the combo. Who knows? So we can create our own combos here. Let's add the light punch. I have 0.5 seconds to press it. And let's add the next part of the combo, which would be the up key. And again, I will leave this like this. Let's save it and let's test it. Now, when I start my combo, which starts with the light punch, which is C. Oh, I didn't click on the viewport. You will see that my combo action starts checking if it can progress the combo or if it can trigger, and if it can't, then it gets cancelled. So if I press light punch, after 0.5 seconds, which is the time frame that I gave the combo, because I didn't press the other key, then it gets cancelled. Now if I do press the up key, I'll press C and then up, or I took too long. I see that right now it's not working. Now, why is this? Because my up key needs to trigger, and right now the trigger for this is a corded action, so I should really delete this. So the combo won't trigger if all the actions don't trigger either. Just take that in consideration. It's especially a good lesson to learn if you are trying to make a fighting game. So again, show debug. Now if I press C and up, you can see now that I have the completed and the trigger actions, states of my actual combo. So I can trigger my combos that way. So all action in the combo array needs to be pressed sequentially within the specified time frame. So if we were adding like a type of Shoryuken example for the Street Fighter series, I have my up key. I'll duplicate this. This will be forward key. Now, why am I calling it forward? Because it really depends on it's not always the right key or the left key. It really depends on where the character is facing, right? So that's why I call it forward. So let's add my forward mapping. And again, this is a very simple example, simple implementation. I'm not trying to get on the specific on how to implement a Shoryuken type of input. So for now, the forward key, I'll just put it to the right key. And the heavy attack will be the actual trigger, the Shoryuken. So the combo for this, and you can open everything if you just hold shift and click. This opens every value inside these drop downs. And you can do the same to close them. Yes, it's pretty handy. So the actual combo is forward, if I can find it, then up, and finally a light punch in our case. Now let's try it. If I press forward, up, C, completed and trigger. Perfect. Now you may want to change the timing. And this is something that I found while I was creating this tutorial. For sure, 0.5 is a lot of time. So if we change it to 0.2 for the combo for us to try to activate this combo a little bit faster, or we're making our players do the key press a lot faster, right? We're making the combo tighter. If you try to do it, oh, it worked actually. Well, you see, you will see like mixed signals, like cancelled, completed, and I'm pressing it at the same time. Now, why is this? Let me open the debug When I'm pressing the up, excuse me, the forward, right now it's using the default down trigger functionality or behavior, the same as the others. And this may not be the thing that you're looking for, because the actual triggering, the continuously triggering event, and let me show you again. If I'm pressing, you see that the forward key is continuously triggered. Yeah, so that can cause a problem whenever you have this time to press key number a little bit too low. So in order to fix this, just don't forget to put the action as a press trigger input. Otherwise, you won't be able to trigger the combo at a fast speed. So in the light punch, we just need the pressed up key, also pressed, and again here pressed. You can also use tap, it should work also. And now you really can, you can see that I'm pressing it at the same speed and I'm getting consistent behavior because I'm using it. I'm using the pressed trigger for the actual input actions that makes up the combo. I just wanted to point that thing which was making me really mad because I couldn't get consistent results. Yeah, you can try it with the press or also with the tap. Now that we have the basics sorted out, we can go in a little bit deeper into what makes the enhanced input system so good. For example, changing the actual mapping context. Let's say that our character will pick up a power-up and will make their heavy attack heavier, or it can grant the heavy attack, right? So let's say that here, let's just remove our heavy attack. We have deleted it from our character. Now if we try to do a heavy attack, we can't. We can right click all we want, but nothing will happen. So let's say that whenever the game starts here, after maybe 3 seconds, the character will become supercharged. So let's type the character is now supercharged. And maybe this is like this. But what does this mean? This means that I will let the player do the actual heavy attack. But I don't want to mess too much with any of these other inputs. So the way we can do this type of functionality is just creating a new mapping context. So let's do that. Let's again right click, input mapping context. And this will be the input mapping context for the supercharged player. And inside it, we will create the mapping for our heavy attack, which is here. And again, this is the right click. Perfect. We save it. And now we just need to give this new mapping context. And we can do the same thing that we did before. We can drag it from here. I will drag it from here because otherwise you will copy and paste this. And let's add a mapping context. Let's select our supercharged player and leave it like it is right now. So for example, if I press play, I'm right-clicking, 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 nothing happens. After 3 seconds, my character is supercharged, and whenever I right-click, we can see that the triggers and the completed messages appear. It's pretty cool, right? So just so we have a way of showing that stuff's happening, let's use an animation from the actual character. So if we go to Paragon Aurora, characters, heroes, Aurora, animations, there will be an ability. Oh, this is it, ability E. Yeah, this is the animation that will get triggered. And let's right click it, create an animation montage. This will be useful for us to play the animation on top of the current animations. So we don't need to create another animation state. I cover the animations. We have a tutorial for that. Do look for it. So in this case, right click, ability E, animation montage is fine. Let's open it, and we need to make sure that our default slot is changed to the, I believe it was the default upper body. Let's save it. Let's go back to our character and let's search for our input action. Where is it? Here it is. So you've seen that it gets triggered a lot of times, and I don't want to play that animation like 100 times if I'm just holding the key. I just want to play it when this input action starts. Doesn't mean it has been triggered, but just knowing that the key was pressed is enough for me. So to play the animation, I do need to get the actual skeletal mesh, which is this component. So let's just drag and drop it. From the mesh, I'll play animation, and you will find this play montage node. And let's connect it to started. Let's select the montage that we just created. And that's pretty much it. We really don't need to do anything else. Let's compile. And if for some reason it doesn't work, oh, it did work, perfect. If it didn't work for you, make sure that you are using the correct slot here. This is because in the animation blueprint, that slot allows you to combine the animations. So we go deeper into that in our animation blueprint tutorial. Okay, so we have the action montage, and you will see that we are not playing the montage until we are overcharged. I played too much Team Fortress 2 in my past. Until we are supercharged. Then we can play the action montage. Perfect. Now, what would happen if in my new mapping, and I will go to my old player mapping, search for it with this button, and open the supercharged mapping. What will happen if I decide to add my jump action here? And I decide to to change the input. Let's say I want to jump with the up key. Now here are two problems. One, I'm using the same input action, and I'm using a mapping of a key that already exists here. Now I'll press play and let me increase the time before getting supercharged to 10 seconds. Why? Because I want to press the up key here and see what's happening here. Now after 10 seconds the character will be supercharged, and you will see that now we have two contexts in place. Now the heavy key works just as we left it, but the jump, if I press the spacebar, oh, I didn't call it the same. That one was character jump. Excuse me. I need to call it character jump. Yeah. Okay. Let's press play. Again, let's open our show debug enhance input, and let's just wait for the new input mapping. Okay, so let's press jump. Now you will see that there's no problem, but our spacebar is activating also the input action in our other mapping. So, and also if I press the up key, is activating the input character jump in the base player mapping. So what we have done with this is that essentially like coming here and adding the same mapping like this, and it not in the up key, it will be the character jump. Okay, something like this. Now, but what's the issue? The issue is that this up key, and now I can just return it to 2 seconds, so it's happening faster. Okay, so after 2 seconds, here our up key, it says that it has been overridden by the supercharged player character input. So if we try to press up, is listening to the new bind that the up key has been binded to, which is the character jump input action. Now, if you want to decide which one has priority, let's say, oh, I have this, but if it's being implemented in another mapping, then I should use the previous one. Then you can define the priority whenever you add the mapping context. Priority. Higher priority mappings will be applied first and will block lower priority ones. So I would need to here just put one, and now the base input mapping context will be the one that has the priority, and it won't be overridden by an input mapping context with a lower priority, which we can actually see. Now the context with more priority is up top, and the supercharged player is in the bottom, and you will see that now that this one is the one that has been overridden, and it will tell you the key, well, the input action where it's being overridden. Yeah, so that way you can determine which one of the mapping context you can use when, which one has a priority, and also you can remove mapping contexts. If you search for mapping, you can clear all the mappings, remove mapping context. It will ask you which one of them you want to remove. And it's very useful. And it's very useful. In this next example, I will show you especially why. But again, this is how you can add. I was getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry for that. But this is how you can add contexts, input mapping context. How to say it better? You can add mapping contexts based on the actual game context. You get a new weapon, you probably will want to get new inputs. Maybe, maybe not, but now you have the ability. Now let's talk about player mappable input config. Mappable configs are a collection of input mapping contexts that represent one config or configuration or preset of mappings. In our case, we will create an alternative mappable config to attack with the right click instead of the left click, and do the heavy attack with the left click instead of the right click. You usually will want to create whenever you have a game and you want to provide more ease of access. You can create a set of configurations for the players that are left-handed and for the players that are right-handed. And this lets you do it very easily. So what do we need to do? We go here, input player mappable input config. We will call it player mappable input config, and you could call it lefty. I'll just call it alternate. So it's a way of saving the scheme, different schemes of keys that you can provide to your users. Okay, so we can change the input of the attacks. Here is the player mappable config name. This is just alternate. Metadata and the context that I want to apply whenever this mappable player mappable input context is added. So I will need to create an input mapping context here. So I can create it just like this. And let's save it as input mapping context alternative scheme. And inside it, I just double click that. I'll add the mappings for the input, for the input action attack, which is now with the right mouse button, and the heavy attack, which is now using the left one. Just click here and again to get these values. Okay, let's save it. This one, if I needed to add more context, then I could. And let's add it here. So after maybe 2 seconds, just so we can see the transition, I'll add from the enhanced input local player subsystem, I'll add a player, add player mappable config. I'll put it here. The config is this one, and that's pretty much it. So whenever I compile, let me save everything just in case I crash. So let's press play. Let's show the debug. After 5 seconds, I'll get my supercharged player. And after the actual 2 seconds, I get my alternate scheme. Now, if you see that's not working, you will be actually right. And maybe I forgot to do something here. Left mouse button, right mouse button. Oh, okay. So let me just return the priority of this to 0 and return my input, this character jump. Oh, I don't need to actually remove it. Yeah, I can leave it like that. Yeah, let me just leave it like that. Okay, so I just needed to return that to 0. So now the supercharge is on top, and then we have the alternate scheme. And you will see that the alternate scheme is being overridden by the actual heavy attack. So now if I try to do the left, I'm doing the heavy attack, and the right, I'm also doing the heavy attack. So we have a bit of a conundrum. Now here we can specify the actual priority this will take. So putting like 10 or 100, you can make sure that we will take in consideration this actual mapping context. Now let's press play, and now you know why it's so important to define priorities. Supercharged player, and after that we are overriding the right mouse button and the left attack. Now if I left click, I do the heavy attack, and if I right click, I do the normal attack. Yeah, it's pretty convenient. Now, something you must take in consideration is that, let's say that we didn't get supercharged. We didn't pick up that power up, but we are applying this new player mappable config that inside it you have the input mapping context that it's adding a heavy attack here. What will happen here, and let me just remove the delays, just connect it like this. And now let's try it. You will see that the alternative scheme has added the attack and also the heavy attack, even though we weren't supercharged, and we can actually use the heavy attack and use the left, the normal attack. So you need to take in consideration that if you're going to add alternatives, you really must check if you have an extra context and try to handle those cases independently from each other. So that way you can make sure that you're not adding actions that the player shouldn't have. The last topic I want to cover is the platform settings, just to cover most of the things that you can do with the enhanced input. So I'm closing everything with the middle mouse button. I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to go to Project Settings. So platform settings, if needed, you can add different input settings for different platforms, such as rotating the face button on the Nintendo Switch or altering the actions available on mobile devices. Enhanced input provides a per platform mapping context redirect that allows you to do this very easily. So I'm opening this just to have it here. Let's go to my content drawer. I can make a blueprint, and let's call it, go to all classes, enhanced, search for enhanced input platform data, select, you have this new blueprint. Let's just call it enhanced input platform data. And usually you will want to have the name of the actual platform you are targeting. So this may be, let's just call it Windows. Let's double click it. And now here in mapping context redirect, you can select whenever you are using a certain mapping context to which other context it will get redirected. For example, you remember that we had the alternative scheme. Okay, we will need to, so the way this should work is you have your mapping context, the player, and you just duplicate this, and this is no longer the player, it will be the player, but for the platform. If it could be Nintendo Switch, it could be really whatever. And you can have as many redirects as you want, as long as the keys are not empty. So in these player windows, instead of attacking with the left mouse button, I'm going to attack with the right one. Instead of jumping with the spacebar, I'm going to jump with the enter key. Let's save it. And now in my blueprint, I'm selecting the player will actually, in this platform, will be redirected to the player windows. Let's compile. Let's save it. We could add another redirect. We don't need it. Again, let's save it. And let me put it here so it's a little bit easier to navigate. Right. So after adding this redirect, we can go to the project settings. Let's search for enhanced input in the categories. Here it is. And now in platform settings, we can select our platforms. You will have more platforms if you make deals with either Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft to get the actual SDK to develop for their platform, and then you will get a special version of Unreal that you can build and you will have more platform settings. In our case, this is all we have. We have the Windows one, default, input data, and let's add our class. And that's how now, whenever I use this platform, our player mapping context will be redirected to the player Windows context. Now, this is a Windows machine. So if I press play and I press the left key, and let me just remove this alternate mapping. Yeah, before I forget, I'll just remove it. I'm leaving it as it was at the end, at the start. Test map. Let's press play. And you will see that my left click is not doing anything. My spacebar is also not doing anything. If I check my show debug enhanced input, now I see that the IMC player was redirected to the player windows, redirected context. And now the right click is actually the normal attack, and the enter key is our jump. It's pretty useful whenever you are dealing with more than one controller. So if you wanted to know how can you handle whenever you have a PlayStation controller which you want to cancel stuff with the X key, but the same X key position is the A button in the Nintendo Switch, well, you can handle it like this. It's pretty simple. In conclusion, today's lecture on the enhanced input system introduced in Unreal Engine 5.1 officially has covered the core concept, transitioning from the legacy system, examining examples, exploring trigger states, and implementing various input triggers. We also discussed changing the mapping context, creating player mappable input configs, and platform-specific settings. By understanding and utilizing the enhanced input system, you can create highly versatile and customizable input schemes for your games, making them more accessible and more enjoyable for a wide range of players. As you continue to develop your skills in Unreal Engine 5, take the time to refine your craft and explore the possibilities of the enhanced input system. In doing so, you will be well on your way to create exceptional gaming experiences for players around the world.